Welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn. For those of you who haven't met me, my name's Kirsten Gunnis. Please excuse my voice. I'm doing well with a cold at the moment. Today's Lunch and Learn is all about negotiation. So how you can create a win-win outcome every time you do a negotiation. So today we actually have Lisa Sweeney as our amazing Lunch and Learn presenter. For those of you who haven't met Lisa before, Lisa is actually the CEO of Business in Heels. So I actually had to work with one of my counterparts. Lisa comes with 25 years of experience in retail, running large sections of buying offices for Target Australia, Spotlight, Best and Less, some of those great big brands here in Australia. During that time, Lisa's actually honed those negotiation skills whilst she cut deals on products ranging from clothing to hard goods and licensing across multiple countries. So wealth of experience and knowledge there on how to create those win-win outcomes. She then stepped down from corporate retail, went on to establish Business and Heels, which spans multiple industries and countries with a vision to create an unlimited future for women. So I might hand over to you, Lisa. I'm looking forward to learn more about how you can sort of get around negotiation, how you won't be frustrated. And there's quite a few things that we're going to be dealing with today. So I'm looking forward to learn all about those. So I'll turn over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that wonderful introduction. It was great. It's great to be here and great to be talking about a topic that I'm really passionate about. One of the things that makes a huge difference, people often look at negotiation and think, yeah, you know, it's something you do to close a sale or develop a deal. But actually, in your working life and your personal life, most of our time we spend negotiating with people. And it's a very important topic. So let's just go through and talk about briefly what we're going to cover off. So many of you would be frustrated, and I bet if I gave you an example of dealing with teenage kids, you could think of a number of different ways you've been frustrated with the outcome of your negotiations. Oftentimes receiving a flat no, will you tidy up your room, or less than ideal outcomes because suddenly they've left and the room is still not tidy. In this workshop, we're going to learn the power of persuasion and influencing, how to set yourself up to achieve your goals, and we're going to cover the tips and tools to keep the negotiation moving, and how to create win-win outcomes. So as Kirsten mentioned to you, that I'm the CEO of Business in Heels, but for many years I spent a lot of my life in retail negotiating. And whether you're in a buying position or whether you're actually in retail on the floor, every day you're dealing with people, you're negotiating with them. You're influencing them in some way, shape or form to achieve an outcome. Now, a proper negotiation to close a big deal comes with a whole lot more scope and work than on a little discussion with a customer on the shop floor. So what we're going to cover off today is some of the elements that go behind what that looks like. And I negotiated deals from, you know, getting unique products from Disney into Target Australia and being able to come out with a particular showcase event. I ran the toy sale for Target. Behind each one of those is a myriad of negotiations that we had to do both externally and internally. So it comes with a whole lot of interesting challenges that we're going to dig into in a little while. So a little bit about Business in Heels. You know, as Kirsten mentioned, that we're all about fast tracking women on their road to success. And we do this through mentoring, education, connection and marketing. So this is part of our educational piece. We really want to see people within our collaborative community being able to really succeed and achieve. And we connect now 200,000 business women. We're opening up in Europe at the moment. We've got branches in UAE and Malaysia, and there's lots of opportunity for you to connect with women from across the globe. So for all of those of you who are now online with us, can you please just simply turn off your weapons of mass distraction? That would be your social media feed going off on one side, or your mobile phone, and just give yourself a little bit of me time to focus on how to create win-win negotiations. So let's just start off with a little bit of what are the different sort of negotiations that you can have. There are negotiations that you might be having internally within your organization. So every time you pitch an idea, a product, you want to go for more resources, you want to go for a promotion, you want to pay a rise. These are all different sorts of negotiations. So for anybody who's with us today, why don't you put a little bit of information into the chat as to any particular negotiations that you want some help with. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, it could be negotiations right down to dealing with teenage children. There's the same techniques and tips apply. So obviously the homework will be a little bit different, but negotiations and influencing are skills that stand you in really great stead. So if you've got any particular types of negotiation that you'd like help with, let's put it in the chat and we'll make sure we cover off a bit of that discussion as we go along. So let's start off with a little bit of the common reasons why negotiations fail. So quite often people, and I'm sure you've had this even in your own personal life, people come out with a list of demands. I want you to do this. You must do that. And what's your initial reaction when someone comes up to you with a must or you have to do? It's to arc up and to say, look, no, I'm not going to do that. And so the more aggressive and assertive you are often, the more likely you are to actually get a rejection. A lack of preparation's another part. Not truly understanding what people want is another part of why negotiations fail. It's really important, and we'll talk a bit more about how important it is to do your homework. Lack of framework of understanding. Every situation is different. And so whether you're dealing with an internal environment where you might be dealing with a whole lot of politics, you need to tread carefully and understand the situation. So if you are going to propose a new concept for your organization, you wouldn't come out with it for the first time at a meeting with everybody there. You would make sure you understand the framework of the context of which you're doing it in and have a discussion with each of the individual stakeholders beforehand to understand what their objections might be and to make sure you've taken those sort of things into consideration so you can overcome them. A failure to build a relationship. You know, it's very hard to negotiate with people where you don't have a relationship. You need to have somebody, even if it's not you there. So sometimes if you're doing overseas negotiations, and I'm not sure whether people are interested in that or not, but once you overlay different countries, different nationalities, different cultures, different religions, you really change the framework of understanding, but you also it's much harder to build relationships. And if you don't have trust and you don't have respect, then you're far more likely to have people that are going to walk away from one another. And so that's really, really important to make sure that you try and build some sort of trust and respect. And one of the first things that would happen if you were in Asia, the first thing that would happen is you would be greeted by people and they would start off with a bit of a ceremony around maybe tea drinking or taking you to lunch or something, so they can get to know you before they start doing any sort of negotiations. Jumping into negotiations straight up is considered quite rude. And that applies here too, even though it's not as culturally defined. People don't like it if you jump straight into a negotiation and they don't know anything about you. Also, you know, if people think it's no longer a good deal or it's not as good as it was represented, they're more likely to be out of it. Confrontational personalities are another side of why people struggle with negotiation and not getting to any conclusion. Sometimes people get lost in the argument and never pull it down to something that anyone can agree with. And that's often true of negotiations that happen when relationships break down. And so, you know, lawyers are often working on mediation where you can get to confrontation with no outcome. So can anyone relate to this? Are these common failures that you've had before? If so, just put a little note into the chat of any of the reasons why negotiations have failed for you. And also if you've got any particular types of negotiations that you would like to dig into. But we'll keep moving along. So there are 5 phases to negotiation, and we're going to dig into each one of these individually. The investigation phase, and this is where you get to set your goals. Determining the best alternatives and considering a range of options. Then the actual presentation, the bargaining, and the closure. So you think about, you've gone to a market and you're overseas and you spotted something you really like. So if you go in and you've not done your homework, how do you know what the right price is? So what is even better to do is go to a number of different stalls and get an idea of what the prices might be before you go to the one you really want. And then you need to, so you've investigated the market, you've determined the best alternative, you've come back to the stall that you really want, and then you actually start off with the bargaining. But you'd never ask for initially the price you want to pay. And this is something that we'll get into a bit more with bargaining. And so you always ask for more than you want. So everybody starts at a different end of the scale and they bargain their way down to a compromise that everyone's happy. So you need to make sure you start off your bargaining at a sufficiently high point so that you've got room to bargain down to get to the price you really want. And then you close the deal. So these are the 5 phases, and it's true for every sort of negotiation. You've got just different segments of these phases take different amounts of time. So one of the first things you really need to do is do your homework and do it thoroughly. So if you're negotiating with an external company, what do you know about them? What are their values? What's really important to them? What are the things that they're likely to compromise on, and what are the things they're not likely to compromise on? If you're dealing internally with part of your organization, I've just put down here thing about jobs. So one of the biggest reasons why people negotiate internally is on their pay. Now, many people say to me that they can negotiate fine for a deal if they're in sales externally, but when it comes to doing their own pay, they just struggle with it, right? Because you're talking about me. And so it's very hard not to be personal. But if you've done your homework, it gives you some objectivity to the discussion. And so something like this pay scale research actually allows you to go out and find out what your job's worth. And then you can stack it up against what you're being paid. And then you've got a bit of an argument as to why you should be paid something different. Just, you know, so the premise is do your homework and do it well, and really thoroughly consider all the different things that you know about people. And so if you're in this situation and you start doing your homework and you realize that actually you don't know, you have no relationship and you don't know much about the people, then what you need to do is start building a relationship becomes your homework, so that you actually start ticking off these boxes and you understand then who you're going to be dealing with and what the likely outcome is going to be, or at least what some of your options are, what's important to them, so that you can then frame up the parameters of what you're thinking about from a negotiation point of view. So get to know the other players and what is important to them. And this might come, particularly if it's an internal thing, it might be about working through with your bosses and understanding what's important to them. Can you ask for a pay rise? Have you just achieved a great outcome and is now the right time to ask for a pay rise? They're not going to tell you that, but you need to just find out what is happening and whether it's an appropriate time to have a discussion. And even if it's not the right time, it's still a good thing to raise. This is one thing that women are terrible at doing, is actually raising when they've had great results, and to ask for a pay rise. And if they say, look, you know, this is not an appropriate time, you say, well, okay, but when is? So understand what's important to the other players. And so if you've just achieved a great outcome for the organisation that helps them tick a whole lot of KPIs off, then now is the right time. And it's good reason why to discuss it. But it's all about getting to know people and what's important to them. And then you need to consider your options and develop your scenarios. So what is your ideal outcome? What's your no-go zone, and what's your go zone? So let me give you some examples. So one of the things that happened to me early on in my career was that we had a whole lot of product from Taiwan that had been produced and was damaged. And so we were in a situation where we had no future orders with this particular company, but I was sent in to negotiate a $125,000 claim. And this is actually particularly challenging when you have no future business. Now, luckily for us, we had an office in Taiwan where we had people that were doing, so they worked as a middleman for us, and they had a number of different clients. So the other clients that worked with this office, which were companies like CNA and various other overseas retailers, actually had other business with this particular supplier. So leveraging off the relationships that we had through the office, we determined what would be the plan. Now, I was working in Australia. We had a great accounts shipping department, and they said to me, we've got to negotiate a $125,000 claim, and they wrote it all out for me, and this is what it's worth. And I said to them, I can't go to Asia and negotiate for $125,000 as a starting point, because you're going to end up with like $55,000 at the other end. We need to work out a way to inflate it so that I can get down to $125,000. Now, Australian people working in accounts had never come across this sort of idea, and of course they'd never negotiated with Asia directly with any success. And this in part was why, because their expectations was that you just ask for 125 and they give it to you, and that was that. So after a whole lot of work with them, we were able to inflate it to about 250,000, knowing that we'd probably end up with 125. And I was put on a plane to go over there. So I landed in sunny Taiwan, and it looked exactly like this. And there's not a lot of coffee shops, and the guy who I was meant to be negotiating with wouldn't come to the meeting. He rang up and said that his mother was sick in hospital. So I'd flown all the way to Taiwan, and there I was stuck, and he was refusing to come in and would not send anybody else from his organization. So, and claiming that his mother was sick. So we waited for a day, and the people in the office were doing their homework on their relationships into the organization. And they said, we think it's a bit of a ruse that he's doing this, that he really is around, but he doesn't want to talk to you, obviously, because he knows you want to negotiate this claim. So we sat down and had a bit of a think tank about what we could do to get him to the table. What leverage did we have? And so they had future orders of something like a couple of $1 million. And so we actually had to threaten to cancel the future orders to get him to the table. And once we had done that, then we were able to have some discussion. And of course, he didn't want to just give us money. He wanted to have some future orders too, because he didn't want us to just walk away. Now, we had a no-go zone there that we didn't want to do any future orders because we felt that we'd be throwing good money after bad. So you can see two sides of the table. But because we started off with the high dollar amount, and because we had the other orders going through with the other companies, were able to come to a settlement at the 125,000 that the company wanted. So without having done some of that homework, without having those relationships, there's no way we would have ended up at that compromise situation. But it took us 5 days of negotiating to get there. So in today's terms, was that a good use of my time? Possibly not, but it certainly was considered that at the time. And as a relatively new buyer, it was a very probably frustrating time for me, and I learned a lot about negotiating. So let's have a look now at some of the gender biases that happen in negotiation that you should be aware of. And then I can overlay it with a little bit of international flavour for those of you who are interested in that. So if we take women and men, and I was talking earlier about pay increases, and Kirsten does a fantastic workshop on valuing your worth, where she talks about some of this stuff. But men negotiate every single time they achieve something. And I know this because I used to run menswear, and most of my team were men. And women negotiate less frequently and more hesitantly, and they ask for less. So, and yet when you dig into the reasoning as to why they should be paid more, they often have a lot more substance behind what they're saying than men. And they also take no for an answer. So in a number of companies, women have been adversely affected by the fact that guys just brush off, or, you know, the person they're negotiating with brush off their request for a pay rise, or brush off their request for a change. They may even have had that committed to, but when they ask for it, they're often brushed off. And so it's a really important skill of negotiating is to just be consistent, to not be emotional, because that's, again, another thing that men go, oh, they're being emotional. No, just be consistent and consistently ask for things. And if now is not the right time, then when is? And when can you come back and revisit the discussion? These are all things that are really important. Now, women also diminish their arguments with sort of, or I think, or I just think, or I just wanted to check whether this was okay. I might be wrong. I'm not the expert. Well, if you're out there negotiating deals, you should be the expert. If you're wanting to influence, do it with strength. Be determined and to speak with conviction on what you believe in. But again, you need to have done your homework with people so that you make sure you consider some of the, and it may be quite reasonable points of view from some of the other stakeholders, and don't get emotional. So I used to have a female boss who at one stage used to have an unfortunate habit of a red rash that used to run up her face every time she got too argumentative. And it was one of the things that people, we always knew then when we'd gone too far with asking for something. And, you know, from her perspective, it was an unfortunate tell as to how she was feeling about something. And of course, there are the biases that say, you know, just because women are assertive that they're being emotional, or often they're mislabeled. However, there are some distinct differences, and there's a lot of men that like game playing, and they see this as a game where they go in with a very aggressive argumentative tack. So in hard goods, this is a common strategy. So this is where people are buying, you know, books or toys, or and there's a lot of game playing. And so guys will deliberately go in with a very argumentative approach to things to try and knock down the salespeople. And it's a tactic. So you need to be aware of it. And the thing that overcomes argumentative people is a consistent, rational approach. And you can say, you know, I think you're getting a little bit emotional here. Perhaps we should take time out. Or, you know, I really don't think that tone's warranted. And again, just come back to your point. So so now we're at the presentation. So there's a lot of work many of you would have heard of Alan Peace and body language and things. There's a huge amount of things that you can do to make your environment appropriate to the negotiation you're about to have. So one of the things when you see these sort of photos and you're looking at the body language, when you've got somebody standing up, leaning on the table, like that's aggressive. It's immediately putting one into a dominant and submissive position. The fact that they're negotiating across the table, again, is setting you up for conflict. And so if you look at the people on the other side, they're sitting on a table next to one another. So when I was negotiating, quite often I would reorganize the room so that the key party and I would be sitting on the corner of the table so that we're across from one another and there was nothing between us. Now, sometimes when you're in Asia and you've actually got a wall of people who are sitting across from you, and that's, again, it's a tactic done in Asia to intimidate, and you might be one, maybe two people on one side of the table and you've got 8 or something sitting across from you. It's very important to just be calm and considered and try and actually talk to the key person that you're talking to without, and not overreact. So your body language is being monitored at all times. So just sitting there quietly with your hands in your lap or on the table and not being defensive is really important. So understand that your room, your position will put you in a good position. Quite often, if people are negotiating for pitching a new idea into senior leadership, again, putting people in the right environment's really important. So if I was going to do a senior leadership pitch, I would have talked to all the stakeholders before I'd done it and gone through some of their objections and made sure that they were addressed in the proposal. Then I would make sure we were in a room where ideally we're at a round table rather than a long table presenting. And quite often, if it is a long table, you might choose to sit in the middle of it so that everybody's around you. So it creates that sense of team and inclusion and commitment rather than you're stuck on the end trying to convert all these people. So again, just think a little bit about your body language and the place where you choose to negotiate with people. And quite often, if you go into your boss's office, you know, sometimes bosses choose to sit behind their desk, behind their computer screen. They might have another table and chairs to the side of that. So quite often, if that was a situation, I would either, if the boss is not likely to move, I'd either pick the chair up so that we're sitting across the corner of the desk. So again, no barriers. Or I would drag them to the table or say, let's go out for a coffee. I want to have a chat with you, and change up the scenery so people are not in that dominant situation. So ask and don't assume your homework was correct. So this is where you're actually getting to the important thing. And it's really important to ask lots of open-ended questions. Don't assume that your homework was entirely correct. It's really important to have some of these questions. So what are you prepared to compromise on? Because sometimes what you think and what they think are two different things. Would you explain the reasons for your position? Is there any reason you can't do whatever you're asking for? What do you think is fair and reasonable term or condition? Why is that point or provision important? What part of my proposal gives you the most concern? So all these are great open-ended questions, and you'll be surprised what answers you get. What documentation or proof do you have to validate your position? And you need to be careful with that, because sometimes that can come across as being quite argumentative if it's more of an opinion-based position. And what else do you think I should know? So again, depending on the person you're negotiating with. So for example, I said earlier, a lot of guys can be quite argumentative and they come out on an aggressive tack. So in that situation, sometimes to change it up, the request for proof and validity stops them from taking a whole lot of stances around things that they are just opinions. So you're trying to find a break in to get the negotiation to be a calm, rational discussion which you can have with somebody else. So we talked earlier about your body language. This is really important, that you're constantly reading what people are thinking and trying to change up the body language. If you end up on any of these sort of body language looks, so if you have a look at the guys on the right, you can see none of them are keen to be there. You know, one's got his hands over his mouth looking really uncomfortable. Another one's got his fingers, he's got his eyes shut. Another one's got his hands blocking his whole face, right? None of them look happy to be in this situation. And you're not going to get to any sort of agreement if everybody's in this situation. You'd be better off getting them up from the table, having a break, having a coffee with them, and trying to actually get everyone to start talking. You know, again, you look at the people on the left-hand side, the guy with his arms folded, you know, he's definitely closed and looking a bit intimidated. We've got people that are hiding. You've got the lady with the hand over her mouth that looks like she's lying. And again, as I said to you, it's really important. This is where your body language can help sort this out too, that you look open and prepared to have a great discussion, that you want to look friendly, that you want to be engaging. You know, sometimes it might be that you throw out the odd joke. It's important to understand these non-verbal cues so that you keep the change, and that's where it can be a little bit challenging. So I'm not sure if any of you are from India or have negotiated in India, but sometimes, and many Western negotiators have been totally tripped up on this, no means yes and yes means no. It's important to understand what and who you're negotiating with. Now, I had a very interesting situation when we first went into Bangladesh, and I was the team leader in there with a team of male buyers, and we were going through a number of factories discussing things. The factory owners, it's a very patriarchal society, do not believe women should be in business, nor did they want to do business with me. And so they were talking to the guys in my team and not to me. And of course, the guys were deferring to me because we had bigger decisions to make that affected the things. And so we ended up to change the situation a bit. We actually ended up having to get the guys to walk out of the room to go down and have a look at the factory and do a bit of a tour whilst we actually started the negotiation. Now, interestingly enough, once we got over that and we started building the relationship, I still to today talk to some of those men that didn't want to talk to me in Bangladesh. So I think it's an interesting thing. Once you put the time and effort to build the relationship, it often sticks. So let's have an example. So keeping the conversation going. Now, we had a situation where we were buying a huge amount of lycra garments from a particular supplier. And we wanted to change up our payment terms. So lots of you understand how payment terms work. And with large organisations, you know, they're always wanting to pay later rather than earlier. So I was out there negotiating with them to work out how we could pay them a month later. So essentially they had to cover that cash for 30 days. Now, of course, I didn't want to do that. And I totally understand now, being on the other side of the fence, exactly why. So we had a long discussion about it, and their initial response was no. And so we started talking about, well, because you're running a just-in-time service for us, how much stock are you carrying? Because this is the stock that you've invested in that's unpaid for. And could we actually reduce the amount of stock that they were carrying to free up the cash to cover that month's worth of money that we wanted to get? And so when we started having a look at that, they couldn't do it in isolation. So we ended up having to do, and it turned out to be quite a long negotiation, but we ended up having to get in the yarn supplier as well as the fabric supplier and them. And what had transpired was that everybody in their own isolated bubble with no forecasting was keeping buffers of stock and money for us, tying up money for us without understanding if and when it would be taken up. So we committed to giving, so our compromise was that we would give them 6 months worth of forecast of exactly when we wanted the goods, which meant that everybody could take out of their system a whole lot of extra money and capital that they were tying up for us, which then made it feasible for everybody. And actually it turned out that it was a good bonus to everybody, but it required all of us to give a commitment together to achieve the goal that we were trying to shoot for. So as I said, keep the conversation going, and you don't know where it, so I didn't go into that. I knew what the outcome needed to be, but I didn't go in understanding the how. And so it wasn't until we got all the three parties at the table that we realized what the best how was going to be. And so we knew what we needed to do was to free up cash. But again, it was, it wasn't just my supplier's cash, it was the fabric guy's cash, it was the yarn people's cash, and everybody ended up with a more efficient outcome and a much better relationship as a result of the negotiation. But you couldn't have actually worked out what all of those things were. So coming in with open-ended questions, understanding the how to. Now, as a person that was working for a large corporate, I could have gone in really hard and just told them it was my way or the highway and walked away. But what would have happened in the long run? Would I have had a supplier, would I have tipped the supplier over? Would I have ended up with late deliveries? Would I have ended up being short delivered on various things? Quite possibly. But because I made the effort to work with them and their suppliers, then we actually all ended up with a much better relationship, much more buy-in. Every time there were opportunities to capitalize on things, I got the opportunity because I had made the effort. So to me, that's a real win-win negotiation. But if I had not have asked those open-ended questions and been open to different ways of achieving it, I never would have got there. So finding the win-win. It's really important to separate the people from the problems. Now, some people like to negotiate personally, and that never works. So as I said earlier, take the personalities out of the negotiation, take the people out of the negotiation, try and stick to the facts. So if you want to have a pay rise, right, it's about the money, it's about the numbers, it's about where you sit in the marketplace. It's not about you personally. So try and detach the two, because it tends, then you take it personally and you get upset and then you don't negotiate so well. And so again, if you can try and focus on the facts, and ask, you can ask people, how would you feel if you weren't valued for the work that you do? Ask the open-ended questions, but try not to make it personal. Focus on interests, not positions. So again, try and understand what are the important things to people, not their actual position. And then try and throw out lots of options. The best negotiators that I've come across are the ones open to real win-win different solutions, and often will come out with some solution that's very left of centre. But it only comes out with a lot of conversation, and that's really where you're building relationships and you're giving people that chance. So you use objective criteria and know your best alternatives. And so if you're in a situation like I was, where I was negotiating those trading terms, and I had that situation with my Lycra supplier, but then I went to another supplier and I had a different situation. By the time you negotiated 4 or 5 of these, you had like a suite of potentially different solutions that you could trot out. And so one of the things was I wasn't the only one doing it. So myself and the other business managers also brainstormed what some of the different solutions we were coming up with. and understanding what some of the different alternatives are. And for many of you, which you're in organisations, and it might be that you're negotiating salary, or it might be you're pitching ideas, there'll be other people like you doing it as well, and they may have different perspectives on how your best alternatives might be. So make sure you don't underestimate your network as a great source of knowing what some of these different alternatives are. So in order to go forward for yourself and for the future, and to make the most of win-win negotiations, I know I've only just touched on the surface. I've just given you a small framework, and many of you are going to have unique and different problems and things that you want to tackle and challenges. So you've got a choice. You know, you can take that framework and work on it by yourself. For anybody that's been attending this today, I'm happy to give you 30-minute session just to talk through your particular challenges. There is a lot more to negotiation, obviously. It's taken me 25 years than I've covered here, and there are a number of nuances and variations that we haven't covered in this, that, you know, go down to different cultures, and how do you build relationships in different countries, and how do you make sure people, you know, don't lose face and things in the conversations. So now let's have a look and see what people are thinking. Is there anybody here that's got a particular question about negotiations, or a particular problem or a challenge that they would like to share?
So I'm just checking with everybody. So if there are any questions, please add those into the chat. We're more than happy to try and answer some of those very specific items. Excuse my voice. Otherwise, obviously the link is there to connect if you want to talk, you know, more privately with Lisa about a particular subject. Sometimes we understand that you know, you may not want to raise those elements in a public forum, so we understand that. But you know, there's lots of information that Lisa's shared today. You know, I made a comment in the chat box. You know, one of the things, having worked in corporate both internationally and domestically, you know, no for me is I've had to teach myself to hear the word as no, not right now, and so that it gives me the opportunity to revert to. So if it's not right now, when would be the best time to talk about it? Because, you know, I've had to learn at some points they might say no, but they don't really mean that. It's just I'm just too busy and I've got 4 million other things going through my head and I just can't cope with another thing. So we've got a great question, perhaps some about salary negotiations when applying for a new role, key points other than being able to point out your value. So what are your thoughts there, Lisa?
Well, and I'm sure you've got a few thoughts to add to this too, Kirsten. When you're talking about new roles, understanding what the person hiring is really looking for. So what are the values, the KPIs, the environment, again, doing your homework. So it might be that you know somebody who works in the organisation that knows that person is hiring for somebody with particular skills. For example, they might be the not detail person. They need to have somebody around them really loves detail because they need that within the team. So there are often key points that you can ask, and you can ask these in open-ended questions, right? And then you can bring it back to your skill level. So quite often it would be, you know, what particular skills are you looking for, or what particular, you know, as part of your team culture, are you really lacking people with any particular mindset or type? Kirsten, have you got any other thoughts that you want to add to?
I was just making a couple of notes on this one. You know, one of the things that I quite often talk to people about is understanding the strategic imperatives of the overall organisation, because obviously everybody is, you know, KPI'd on those strategic imperatives. They're the most important thing that a company is trying to achieve. So I think always look at those and then be able to articulate what you bring that helps make the organization meet those imperatives. So yes, it is sort of value, but you can actually take it a couple of steps further and go, I know that there's a gap in being able to achieve those strategic imperatives. If I'm going to close that gap, what skills that I've got that I can use to actually close that particular gap? You know, I wrote my own business case once because for a brand new role, because I was sick of doing what I was doing and I was worn out. But I actually then used what was motivating my executive team in the APAC region by saying, here's where we're needing to be, here's why we're not going to meet it, and this is how this new role can meet that. And out of that business case, I actually got myself a brand new role and another 4 people, funnily enough. So I think that's a really good thing. Not just looking at, Lisa talked about previously about, going out and doing your homework. Go to places like Glassdoor and put in the role, the job role. There's great places like Hayes, Glassdoor, Michael Page. Get an understanding of what other organisations are paying. If you're working for large organisations, they're doing that. And they're managing their pay scales based on what's being paid in the market. So, it's applying those sorts of things. Sometimes it's actually having some good sponsorship as well. So, is there more than one decision maker for that role? Understand who those decision makers are, because you've then got to make sure that you've got a relationship. And I think the last thing that I would probably do is a bit of a perception audit. Understand how you view yourself as a brand, but also understand how do other people view your brand. I've lost out on roles because how I saw myself was very different to how decision makers may have seen me. And I didn't quite, their perception didn't meet what they thought the role needed. So I think, doing that, all of those elements does help.
And so from my perspective, I had a very interesting negotiation when I went to Spotlight. So I'd come out of a very large organisation that was banded from a salary perspective, and I went into a business owned by 2 brothers. And they didn't, a very different negotiation. Now, they had in mind what they wanted to pay in the salary, but potentially there were a whole lot of other benefits. So as I talked to various people that I knew within the organisation, I realised that actually things like novated leases for cars, even some overseas travel and various other things, that they were willing to compromise on and throw some of these in as part of the package, because to them they weren't important, whereas salary by itself was. And so I was able to actually package up a totally different package, which included base salary plus novated lease plus a whole lot of international travel, which gave me a better position than I currently was in, even though the base salary was similar or slightly less, plus bonuses. So the outcome was way more, but again, it was because I was open to a whole different way of valuing things. And again,
and that's a really good point, I think, Lisa, is that organisations are very sensitive around the labour line on their profit and loss. And because most companies band their pay scales, so do look at what I class as opportunities. So, understand what other options are available out there. But feel free to reach out to either of us. We've both got great experiences, and we're more than happy to sort of talk through a particular scenario. Maybe we can come up with other solutions as well.
Yeah, actually, and so when I finished that negotiation off, right, because I went in with the whole list, I actually exhausted it, and they said yes to everything, and I walked out thinking, shit, didn't ask for enough. And so there's some of the things, because you actually want to have a little bit of pushback to make you feel like you've stretched. So it's good to have an exhaustive list of things that you want to have. So Negotiations, as I said, is it's a really interesting field, and creating win-win is all about the conversation and really understanding what people want. So with that, I think we'll wrap. So hopefully,
yes, I don't believe there's any other questions, but please feel free to reach out to Lisa. The item is there. If there are other scenarios that you'd like to talk to either Lisa or myself with, please reach out to us. Otherwise, thank you very much, Lisa, for providing such great information. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. We really appreciate that. Keep an eye out for future Lunch and Learns. We've got some other great conversations coming up with different people on different subjects. And we'll also make this available through our YouTube channel within the next few days if you want to go back and relook. Thank you very much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon.
Thanks, Kirsten.